welcome to the Good Stories Podcast. My name is Jody, here with my brother Steven, and it's a good thing too, because if I'm honest, today's book is one that, while I really enjoyed reading it, I would have a hard time describing it by myself. So when we started this podcast, it was because I would read books that were a little bit beyond me, and Stevie is a great help in understanding the hard parts. So this actually feels more like old times to me. But first, some podcast stuff of note. We recently joined the big world of YouTube. So it's a really cool way that you guys can find and listen to our episodes. And actually, several people who listened before have told me that now they've shifted to listening through YouTube. So apparently it's preferable in some ways, and I like it because I can see more of how many people are listening out there, which is great. It has more analytics. But I can only see your name if you subscribe. So as the old saying goes, smash that subscribe button. Do people still say that?
I don't know.
It was a thing for a while. Smash that subscribe button. But we are on YouTube. And here's our top 5 new download locations this week. So hello to you out there listening from Bedford, Massachusetts, Miami, Florida, Elmore, Ohio, Quitman, Georgia, and Utica, New York. Thank you all for listening. You can let us know you're out there by dropping a rating, hopefully a good one, or you can always email us at goodstoriespodcast@gmail.com. All right, that's my business stuff. On to the story. Most of you out there have probably heard the names Thor, Loki, and Odin. They show up, small ways or big ways, in a lot of modern movies and retellings these days, but those names and those stories are actually really old. And a big part of what we know about them comes from a book called the Prose Edda, written by a man with what might be the greatest author name of all time, Snorri Sturluson. Now, there are more layers to that, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but that is our story for today. Really, the Norse gods and mythology, from creation to Ragnarok. That's their end of the world. It's not really one single story, so much as a complicated web of lots of stories. But we're going to share the biggest pieces. Time for a story.
Christianity came to Iceland around the year 1000 AD. By the year 1200, the old gods had faded and were in danger of being forgotten completely. The stories of Odin and Thor were no longer known by all, and the ancient songs and poems were in danger of obscurity and obsolescence. Attempting to forestall this, the poet Snorri Sturluson puts into writing the great work known to us as the Younger Edda. This wide-ranging work tells the stories of the gods and provides crucial background information for the appreciation of skaldic poetry.
Very good. So, questions already. What is skaldic?
Skalds are poets, minstrels, those who wrote songs and poems and words in the Scandinavian regions.
Yeah. So, to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, because I read this 2 times in preparation for today, and I still don't feel like I get it. I mean, it's just so much. There's so many stories inside of it. So please correct me, brother. But the Prose Edda and the Younger Edda are the same, correct?
Correct. This particular work goes by any one of 3 different names usually. Most commonly, it is called the Prose Edda, the Younger Edda, or Snorri's Edda.
And mine has written in around 1200, the year 1200. Yes?
Yes, probably a little bit after. Probably in the 1220s is when we think he actually put pen to paper and wrote this down.
Okay, so spoiler alert, I don't think is needed on this one. These have been around centuries and centuries. And you've heard pieces of these stories probably, but probably not all of them unless you've picked this up and read it.
Maybe the one spoiler we should give for this is I will probably reference some Marvel movies and some other modern literature where the Norse pantheon comes into play. And so I might spoil some of those things accidentally as I describe how they agree and differ from the source material we're going over here.
Well, you've seen more of them than I have. I think I've only seen the first Avengers movie.
Oh, yeah.
So Thor and Loki aren't in that.
Mm-hmm.
Odin isn't. Is Odin in other ones?
Oh, yes.
The All-Father shows up?
The All-Father. So the first Thor movie takes place in Asgard. That's where it starts.
Sorry, haven't seen it.
The All-Father Odin is, of course, played by none other than Hannibal Lecter himself.
I did not know. So since this was written so long ago and in a different language, clearly our versions are going to be different. So I have the Everyman Edda, and mine doesn't have a lot of the poetry in it because there are some, and there's references to the Voluspa, which is different than the Edda. What is the Voluspa?
I think in a minute I'd like to do a little bit of background on Eddas in general, and the Voluspa will come up in connection with that.
Okay.
But short version, the Voluspa is a poem from the Elder Edda. So as Jody just said, she has the Everyman edition. This is a situation where I'm again a little jealous because her edition is better than mine. It's very stripped down, but it includes a lot more of the text. There are many versions of the prose Edda where the translator author basically goes through and picks out things he thinks that we would want to read. So, for example, my version, there's quite a lot that's not in this that I wish were that is in Jody's. I do have some notes in this that are useful, and it's nice big print, but my version is a little bit different.
I learned that Snorri, which is just a great name.
Yeah.
And Sturluson, right? That is Sturl's son.
Mm-hmm.
Snorri Sturl's son, he actually wrote other things, and he was a political mover.
Very much so. And I think that might be a good way to get into this. Let's talk about Scandinavia and let's talk about Iceland and Norway so we know what's really going on here. Again, we've been putting this around the year 1200. A little bit after this was probably written, but that's the time. The world had undergone such incredible changes in the 1,000 years leading up to this. So we had the fall of Rome, we had the rise of all these Western kingdoms and nations, and we had the coming of the Northmen. So this was apocalyptic to many of the cultures of Western Europe, the coming of the Northmen. But to the Northmen, they were their own cultures and their own people, and they had their own gods and their own stories. And so I'm going to start by apologizing to many cultures that I'm going to mispronounce words as we talk about this book. The Norse, the Danish, the Swedes, and above all, the Icelanders, because so much of this takes place in Iceland. The Norse worshipped this pantheon of gods and celebrated these stories that we're about to describe. But by the time of about 1000 AD, that was starting to teeter, and the Norse world, the Scandinavian world, was changing. Norway is one of the biggest, most important countries here, and so I think walking through that can be helpful in sense of a timeline. There was a king of Norway called Håkon the Good. His years are from 920 to 961, and he was the first Christian king of Norway. He actually got himself into some sticky situations because he was not a major proselytizing king, as I understand it. A lot of the times in these countries, when a king converts, he forces his nation to convert with him, but Håkon didn't. And he was still generally well-liked, even by the old god worshippers of the kingdom. But he would find himself in places where he was being asked to do things like eat sacrificial horse meat, or drink blood, or do these things in honor of the old gods, and he really had to walk a fine line. Contrast him to a few years later, the king Olaf Tryggvason. And again, this idea of son at the end of it, like Snorri Sturluson is Snorri, son of Sturli, so Olaf Tryggvason is Olaf, son of Tryggva. So he was a much more aggressive missionary, let's say. As the king of Norway, he was not above engaging with things like torture and forced conversion. So not necessarily the greatest of men, but his reign ended right around 1000. And it is right around 1000 that Iceland also adopted Christianity. Iceland, what a fascinating country out in the middle of the water. I didn't know this until I started researching for this podcast, but it was actually first founded, settled by Irish monks. So Christians who went out there and settled and made monasteries like they do. Not many, though, and that quickly went away. And so when a lot of aristocratic Norse exiles were looking for a place to go, Iceland seemed like a pretty good place. So Iceland has always had these connections to Norway specifically, but also to the greater Scandinavian world. But a lot of it was people going to kind of be out from under the thumb of other rulership or people that were banned from going back to Norway. So you have these aristocratic families that make up this farming land in Iceland, and just incredible stories. Because they were so isolated, because they were so remote, they had some of their own characteristics. And it's from Iceland that we get so many of the Eddas and the sagas. Now, you mentioned Snorri. Let's talk about Snorri. Snorri was born into the very powerful Sturlunger clan. So Snorri Sturluson, right, into that clan. He wasn't raised, though, as part of that clan. And at his time, again, about 200 years after the Christianization of Iceland, there was still those who followed the old gods, or at least still knew of them. The story of how Snorri actually came to power in Iceland is really interesting. His dad was having an encounter with a priest there who was part of another very wealthy family. And that priest's wife got mad at Snorri's dad and came at him with a knife. Said something to the effect of, "I will make you look like this god you so like," referring to the one-eyed Odin. And so she attacks him, stabs him with a knife, missed his eye, cut his cheek. But now there's a feud. Now there is something that needs reconciliation. And so much of Icelandic saga history, so much of what we're going to talk about in the Eddas has to do with this idea of basically insult and then how do you respond to it, because it has to be responded to. Well, the way it got responded to here is Snorri ended up being adopted and fostered by this chieftain, by Pál Solvason in the town of Oddi.
Was that the priest?
That was the priest. He was a priest and a chieftain and an important guy. And then what follows in the life of Snorri is basically a sequence of really powerful moving and shaking. He was a lawyer, he was a poet, and he was what was called a speaker or a law speaker. And I think on 2 separate occasions, he was actually the high speaker of the All Thing. The All Thing being the big gathering of the chieftains of Iceland. Snorri also spent time over in Norway and was actually on good terms, especially as a young man, with the king of Norway at the time. So this was a different king, Hakon Hakansson. And also his co-regent, somebody named Jarl Skuli. Jarl Skuli was very powerful. The king was very powerful, and when you have 2 powerful people coming together, eventually fighting ensues, and no change here. So Snorri ended up actually kind of siding, we think, with Jarl Skuli, and he became very unpopular with the king. So again, during the course of his life, during the time between kind of 1224, 1230, we think Snorri was actually probably the most powerful man in Iceland. But that didn't last forever. And again, he fell out of favor with the king. And by 1241, at 63 years old, he was actually murdered in his home by armed men, we think probably working for the king of Norway. Now, at this time, Iceland was independent from Norway. But there was a growing movement where the aristocrats of Iceland, some of them were under the sway of the king of Norway and were moving to basically become vassals to Norway. Snorri was actually one of the first of these to be under that persuasion and was essentially a speaker for the king in Iceland until he fell out of favor with the king and then he got murdered.
That's complicated.
It is.
The law speaker role, it's interesting when we think back to medieval times. This is, 1200, 1250 in Iceland and Norway. We think of, I don't know, you mentioned chieftains and very tribal in nature, but these are systems. These are powerful players. There's kings and all the things below them and structures. So it's really interesting to me that he could have had that much power at the time when I think of it as kind of fractured. Mm-hmm. But here he's looking back and it's a Christian nation, but in this writing, he's preserving these old stories.
Yes, which gets us into the Eddas, and there are 2 of them. There is what is called the Elder Edda or the Poetic Edda, and then there is what is called the Prose Edda or the Younger Edda or Snorri's Edda, which we are really going to be focusing on today. The Elder Edda is thought to be a collection of oral poems, these tales that were spoken of and were still around before the time of Snorri when these were compiled. Nobody really knows who compiled the Elder Edda. People have claimed Snorri did it in the past, but I don't think most scholars now agree with that. Bottom line, though, these were the oldest Norse literature we have that were originally spoken and now are written down so they could be preserved. The problem, though, though, is their poetry. And I've actually read a lot of these on our podcast when we did various things talking about Nordic history and myth. I've read passages.
It was in the Monster Mashup episode and Farmer Giles of Ham.
Yeah, definitely.
And definitely Beowulf.
Beowulf will factor in, and there's actually some cool connections to Beowulf in the Prose Edda.
So all of those episodes had references to the Edda, and I think a couple others as well. But yeah, going through it, man, it is an arc of story.
Yeah, well, and the thing about that older Edda is that if you don't know the stories that the poems are being told about, it can be really hard to understand what's being said poetically there. But if you know the story behind it, all of a sudden, those really come to life. And there's something that you can see, oh, this is a beautiful way of telling these old stories. Well, for guys like me, when we first read the Poetic Edda, I didn't know the stories behind them, and so it was just confusing. But then I got a hold of Snorri's Edda, and Snorri's Edda did what it was supposed to do. It gave me the background. It's basically an encyclopedia out of which you can then understand these other poetic works. And that was very much Snorri's goal, which he says in the book that he's writing here.
So I've heard many of the stories in here, but as I said, there's hundreds of stories just kind of hooked together, almost chronologically inside of this Younger Edda. What I didn't realize going through it when I went through it this time is it talks about poetry. And so there's the old one that is poetry. And then there's this younger one that talks about the source of poetry, where it even comes from. It's the legend behind poetry.
And what a young scald needs to know in order to be able to effectively write poetry. Because the art is dying. Snorri is he doesn't like where it's going. And these young whippersnappers don't know what they're writing about and can't even read the old stuff because they don't know the stories. So not only does he tell the stories, but he also talks a lot about things like meter and metric. And we'll get into things like kennings and all sorts of cool stuff.
I do like the kennings. And we have talked about those. Does your Younger Edda, does your version have a prologue?
It does have a prologue.
Mine starts very biblically, which surprised me. It sounds like the Christian Bible. Almighty God created heaven and earth and all things in them. And I found a note somewhere, again, I am no expert, but that they think this was kind of tacked on to contextualize the work because Snorri was a politician.
Yeah.
He didn't want to get killed for writing this thing because he's writing in a Christian time, but these pagan Norse god stories. And so they put this prologue in that I feel like it kind of softens the blow.
It definitely does. There's a prologue and there's an afterword, and both of them have this really kind of bizarre feel that is just discordant with the rest of the work. And actually in the introduction to mine, the translator says, yeah, don't bother to read those until you've read the actual stuff in the middle, because these seem to be a very tacked on thing. I guess a couple other things to point out. Well, as you just mentioned, he is a Christian writer writing in a Christian nation. And so this is all written through that lens. These are pre-Christian stories, but they are being told by a Christian with all the hostility that you can imagine could come from that. Although I think Snorri really loved the old stuff. So I don't get a lot of hostility out of him, but there has to be at least the perceived hostility towards it. The other thing to know about this is this was not written in runes. This was written in Old Norse, or I'll say Old Icelandic. Scholars will probably know whether there's a difference between the two. I don't, so I'll use both terms. But this was written in Old Norse, but not in runes. There's a number of different runic alphabets, but by this time in Iceland, those had fallen out of favor, and he was writing in the Latin alphabet. So this is an 800-year-old piece of work, but it references things from much, much further back. And again, it's written at the time where these things were no longer actively believed by the majority of the culture, and that's where you get things like this kind of strange introduction.
I will say before we officially get started with the story part, there are some bizarre ones in here. Like, it's funny the way stories go. Somebody thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, and maybe this will be a good time for age recommendations. What do you think on that?
I think in a movie, don't watch it.
Yeah, it's R.
It's rated R. Yeah, kids should not watch this as a movie. Like if somebody actually did the Younger Edda as a movie, no way. But again, when you read it, they just don't really bother me. It's not so graphic. So high school?
I would say high school. There are certain things in here that if you are reading it to younger kids, you could certainly pick and choose. There are some things that you would probably find awkward to explain.
Yeah.
I've read several different translations of this, and different euphemisms get picked out by translators from time to time. So there are some things that as a grown-up I have realized, oh, well, that's nasty, that I didn't know as a younger guy reading differently translated versions. So it depends how much you want to explain to the little ones or how much you want to skip. But I would say high school, you're probably good to go on this one.
Yeah, and it probably depends on the translation, as you say, because I could see some being a little more flowery in how they translate things, which would be harder to read. Not even the literal meaning of it, discerning that, just difficult to read if it's too much like poetry.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of violence. I mean, that's just part of the world, and the gods are no different on that set. So lots of violence here. There's also a lot of sexual humor and a lot of sexual violence throughout the book. And then there's a fair amount of toilet humor, which depending on the translator, either comes through or it doesn't.
Mine, I got that.
Well, you have the everyman edition.
It was clear to me. I think anyway. All right, so kind of a big picture before we actually begin. I keep teasing starting, but again, this is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of this grand myth cycle, I think, to the whole thing. I mean, we talk through, the stories go through creation and the gods and who's the best god and the other gods, and even the goddesses are listed out by name, almost in rank. But then there's stories about the key ones. And I did love the overlap of stories between the characters. Thor gets angry a lot.
Oh, yeah.
He's kind of comical, actually. And then it all builds up to this idea of Ragnarok, which I read it as the end of time, but it's not, because then there's this renewal afterwards. So it's very much this cyclical arc, but inside of it are all these other things that we'll talk about. Do you have anything to add to that, just as a overview?
I think that's a great description. I guess just technically the book itself, if you would pick up a copy of the Prose Edda, depending on which version you get, is broken up usually into 4 separate parts. So there's that introduction part that we talked about, which is pretty short and kind of weird. There is then a part called Gylfaginning, or the Fooling of Gylf. And that is really, I think, the main part that I read. That's usually the part that is most commonly translated. Following that is another part that talks about the words of the skald and god, Bregi, or Brega, the god of poetry. And this one has a very hard to pronounce name.
I'll give it a whirl. Skaldskaparmal.
Yeah, Skaldskaparmal. So that is the often translated poetical diction, or the art of poetry. And then finally, there's an ending section that is very directly attributed to Snorri himself that is called Hatatal. And this is really a list of verse forms. It's a very technical, poetic work that describes how these things are done. And I guess my last thing before we actually hop into this, the word Edda. Did you come across what that even means and where that comes from? Because we've talked about 2 of them. We've talked about the older and the younger. Did your book have a here's where they think that word comes from?
It didn't in the book. I saw it in some essays. And again, there's debate. The one I see most just kind of agreed upon means poetry or poetic. But then there was other random maybe meanings.
Yeah, and so I find this interesting. Nobody knows, I will say, and there is really a lot of argument. And when I read through different introductions to these, different articles on this, people will feel strongly about one of these, but people will feel equally strongly about different ones. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I just think it's fun to go through the options. I was able to come across 4 main options for the derivation of the word Edda. I mean, in modern time, it's come to represent these 2 works. These are the Eddas. But one option is that it's derived from a town name. I said that Snorri was fostered in the city of Oddi. Oddi is the way I usually see that spelled. Well, Odi in Norse can be manipulated and adjusted to a certain form of it can be Edda. And so the idea is this is a story from Odi. So that's one of them. And I've heard some people say, yes, that's it. Other people say, no, that's ridiculous. And they associate it with the word Other. So Other is poetry or inspiration. So Edda, Other, there's a connection there, and that's the idea that this is basically a book of poetry. Again, some people love that, some people don't. The other one is that there is an Old Norse word, Edda, which simply means great-grandmother. And so the idea is these are the stories that are told by the grandparents, the Edda, which I think is kind of fun. And again, there are some people that like that and some people don't. Here's my favorite one, not favorite in the sense that I think it's the right one, but I just love how philologists can apply logic. And so this one is wonderful. So their argument, this fourth one, is that this is actually derived from a Latin word. So the example they give is the word in Latin credo, C-R-E-D-O, which means I believe. This has been transmuted into Icelandic into the word creda. So credo, creda, meaning just belief. So the Latin word I believe, credo, translated to creda, becomes belief. Well, the Latin word for I write is edo. And so if you take edo, do the same twist on it and make it Edda, then it becomes writing or poetic art. And so that's another fun one. So I don't know the right answer behind any of those four, but I love that people have thought about it this deeply and are willing to argue it to that extreme.
I like the grandmother one. It's kind of source material kind of thing. But the great part about not being an expert is I don't have to prove it. I just like it.
Yeah, I like all four of those in their own right. So the real one, I do not know.
Fair enough. Does your book have pictures?
No.
So my book actually has some illustrations, and at the beginning here, the tricking of Gylfi, King Gylfi, there's this great image of this stack of people he's talking to, and it is so not how I would picture old Icelandic peoples just looking. They're all very tall and lean, not very, like in movies, they're always just jacked and huge, and these are not like that. They're all very lean and tall and skinny. Look, even his sword is very tall and lean. Very interesting. But they dated year 1300. So these have been around a long time. Not at the time of Snorri's writing it, but pretty close.
Yeah, very close to that. All right. Shall we actually do it now?
Do it. Jump in.
Well, I do think we have to start with the foreword. And as you said, this one is a little bit strange. I mean, it starts with, in the beginning, Almighty God created heaven and earth, and all things that belong to them. At last he made two human beings from whom the races are descended, Adam and Eve. Now, when I first cracked open a book of Norse mythology, I did not expect to find Adam and Eve. If you keep reading, you will also find the Tower of Babel, you will find Noah, and you will essentially find the book of Genesis walked through in sort of a skeleton form. Again, this is not Nordic myth. This is a Christian veneer pasted onto the top of it in order to kind of make this acceptable. He also, in the introduction, and I really think this is the take-home part, is after he describes the flood, he then goes on to describe where he thinks the stories of these gods actually came from. And he's very clear. He thinks these were men. These were great men in history who over time took on the aspect or attributions of God and were worshipped by people, and stories were assigned to them. Is that kind of what you got out of this?
Yeah, it gives a parallel story, and it rolls in a lot of things people would have known about. Like it says, the world was divided into 3 regions. It's talking about geography and place, and it really puts this story inside of a context for where it would fit alongside other stories and places people would know about.
Yeah. He talks about Saturn and Crete. He talks about Saturn's son, Jupiter, which in this one I think he equates with Thor. And then eventually, as many of these kinds of introductions do, it lands up in Troy. And with Troy being a descendant of Saturn, and he argues that one of the kings of Troy was actually Odin, who then traveled to the north. and a series of stories ensue. And then this is where the Asa gods came. So this is one of our first real technical terms, the Asa or the Aesir. These are the Norse gods that include most of the big ones you think about, Odin, Thor, Frigg. And so his whole argument is based off of a bad pun and poor philology, the idea that the Asa clearly came from the Asia men, right? These people from Troy in Turkey. And this is his setup, this is his background, and this is how he starts his introduction. Now, as weird as this is, we do see parallels to this in many other stories. Last year, I had the great fortune of getting a copy of the Russian Primary Chronicle, which is wonderful, and the links between Russia and the Vikings are deep and profound, but it starts very much the same way. It starts with basically Genesis creation and then moves forward. And then this whole concept of Troy, building up to Troy as the starting part. Well, we see that over and over again, certainly in the classical world. This is where Rome took their heritage from. That's the whole point of the great epic, the Aeneid, is Aeneas coming out of the flaming ruins of Troy and founding the Roman people in Italy. And then we've also seen it, though, in medieval manuscripts, and the medieval world loved this idea. So if you read through Gawain and the Green Knight, it starts and ends in Troy. And that never really makes sense, but clearly it made sense to the medieval mind, and it makes sense to the Icelandic medieval mind, because he does the same thing. In the introduction, it starts in Troy, and in the afterword, he actually goes back to it and mentions Troy again. So you see that same shaping or framing device that we saw in Gawain and the Green Knight.
I thought it was interesting that they included language. So they're talking about the spread of language starting in Asia, coming from the land of Turkey, and we're talking about Troy as well. And it spreads, and it says the Aesir brought the language north to this part of the world, to Norway, to Sweden, to Denmark, and to Saxony. And in England, again, we're around 1200, the year 1200, and he's already sourcing out. In England, there are ancient names for regions and places which one can tell come from a different language from this one. Mm-hmm. So it's this interweaving of all these stories, but he's finding a place for this one, how it's all derived. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And what's kind of amazing to me is that we do know that languages spread. Mm-hmm. He's not wrong. I mean, as I understand it, the Germanic languages, of which Proto-Norse and Old Norse branch off, are part of the Indo-European language tree. And so there has been this movement, we think, of the languages kind of paralleling the geographical movement he's describing here. So that's just really cool.
It is. So that is the end of my prologue. Do you have any more?
No. And again, the prologue is not the best part of this.
No. It sets the scene for where the overall thing belongs. But it does mention a king of Sweden called King Gylfi. And that is the main part of this book in my mind, the Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi. He's a king who, we'll just read it. King Gylfi was a ruler in what is now called Sweden. Of him it is said that he gave a certain vagrant woman, as a reward for his entertainment, 1 plow land in his kingdom, as much as 4 oxen could plow up in a day and a night. It turns out she's a giant and has giant children, and they have some epic oxen.
Yes, they do.
This is the trick, right? At the very beginning, is this the tricking?
I think there are other tricks that occur. Well, actually, maybe it is. I hadn't thought about it. I assumed the trick was what the Asa do with him later.
Maybe. I don't know. Because I wonder why it was called the tricking of Gylfi. I just thought it was a hilarious beginning. So this giant woman with giant children plow up way more land than the king was expecting, granting this favor.
Yeah, right. Well, and as I understand it, what she carved out basically became Sweden.
Yeah.
I mean, it was huge, the area.
That was a mistake, a rash boon, perhaps.
But in this first part, we get some of the things that are going to be characteristic, part and parcel of the entire story. We get this trickery. We get these powers that are beyond the normal human level. And we get poetry. Because Snorri loved to reference his own poetry. He also loved to reference poetry drawn from the Elder Edda. So at the end of this, he says, "Thus Brage, the old skald, drew from Gylfi the excellent land, Denmark's increase, so that it reeked from the running beasts. 4 heads and 8 eyes bore the oxen, and as they went before the wide, robbed land of the grassy isle." Now, if I read that poem, I would have no idea the story behind it. But now that I know the story behind it, I can read that poem and go, oh, yeah, that's what happened.
Got some oxen.
Can we talk a little bit about the word giant?
Do it.
That is going to come up over and over. And I think anyone who's done any work with anything Norse has come across the idea of the giants or the frost giants. The word translated, as I understand it, is Jotun with a J, Jotun, but pronounced with a Y, Jotun, or in plural, Jotnar. So if you see things with that Jot at the beginning, often that refers to these giants. So Jotunheim is the land of the giants. So Jotnar, Jotun, Jotunheim, Jot. The thing about it is I'm not sure that giant is actually the best translation for it. I heard a professor lecture on this, and he was very convincing to me. His argument was that giant carries certain connotations, most notably size, that these are going to be huge, large creatures. But we get really no evidence of that throughout this entire story. The giants are often indiscernible from the gods in appearance, in skill, in strength, in behavior, and they can intermarry. One can bear another one. Many of the gods have giant parents. It's really pretty fascinating. And so what he liked was the term anti-god. The idea that you have these powerful creatures on par with the gods, in some cases superior, in some cases weaker, but not fundamentally different in kind, just different groupings of them. And I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that. Now, I'm not going to be consistent with that because it usually does get translated giants or frost giants, so I'm going to use those terms. But I keep reminding myself about that concept of it's not that they're that different. You can't necessarily see one of these giants and think a giant as opposed to a god. They're a very similar kind of being.
Well, and they do seem frequently exceptional. So even if these 4 children weren't giant in terms of size, indiscernible in terms of size, they can do things that the gods can do. They can trick the gods. They can take on appearances. Often they can shapeshift. So they tend to have something special about them, definitely different than human. But that's interesting to not think of them as just bigger. That actually makes a lot of sense for these stories.
And so I do like that term, the anti-gods. I think that can be a helpful way of thinking about them. I mean, again, in a perfect world, I would just speak Old Norse and I would just call them Jotun, but I don't live in that world.
So the king here, King Gylfi, is clever, even though he gets tricked. Clever, skilled in magic. And he's quite amazed that the Aesir people had the ability to make everything go in accordance with their will. I'm sure yours is different. This is me reading from my translated copy. But the king basically goes in disguise to find out about the gods.
Mine says he went secretly, having assumed the likeness of an old man and striving thus to disguise himself. But the Aesas were wiser, for they see into the future, and foreseeing his journey before he came, they received him with an eye deceit. And so I thought this was the fooling, the eye deceit, although I agree the other one could be too. But I thought this was the fooling because now the rest of the story is his interaction with them based on this eye deceit.
I would think there's just much trickery in it. And there's trickery in the stories with the gods as well. So, yes, he's disguised. He gives a different name, and he travels to Asgard.
The name is fun. It's Ganglir. So we're going to see that name, Ganglir, which, as I understand, just means walker.
Let's back up a little bit. So in the prologue, you use the term Aesir, and he said, that's clearly the men from Asia.
Yes.
That's not what they mean here, though. Can you bridge that for us?
I can. So the Asa gods are the specific race or subtype of gods. Asa. Aesir is the plural of that. So if you talk about the Aesir, you're talking about the gods of the Norse. If you talk about Asa, you're talking about one of them. But in these translations, sometimes that gets muddled, and so you'll see both get used. You'll also see that name tacked on to other names. So like Asa Thor will show up, and that just tells you Thor of the Aesir.
So the king walks in disguise, and he's already on his guard. Mine says, every doorway before you go through should be peered round, for you cannot know for certain where enemies may be sitting waiting inside. So he's on his guard here, but he sees 3 thrones. And this is so interesting. There's 3 people, 3 thrones sitting on top of each other. And at the bottom, there's a man sitting in the throne named High. The second one, just as high. And the one on top, Third. Mm-hmm. These are interesting names.
And the name, again, depending what translation you have, they might not actually translate those. Sure. So my translation, it's Har, Jofnar, and Thrida. So again, the high one, or high, equally high is the second one, and then the highest of all is the third. So you have a threefold God sitting in council. That's fascinating and really interesting in terms of what that could mean.
Mm-hmm. So I said they traveled to Asgard. What is Asgard?
Asgard is the home of the Asa. Asgard, right? Asgard. It's the protected home of the Asa. So it's the home of the gods.
Yeah, so like in Greek mythology, it's Mount Olympus, right? Mm-hmm. That's where the gods reside when they're not out up to shenanigans.
Yes.
Here it's Asgard. And like you said, I think that's mentioned in many Marvel movies.
Yeah, it is.
There are also a people inside of Stargate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're fantastic. We meet Thor in Stargate. Jody doesn't think highly of the Asgard in Stargate.
In Stargate, they're supposed to be this very advanced race, and they do nothing. They do nothing at all. Okay? It's not all right. They just leave it to the humans to take care of it. Anyway.
So he is now in Asgard. Ganglir has made it. This king has disguised himself. He has approached. He has seen these high gods now in council, this threefold god. He has also seen the guardian who is juggling 7 swords at once in the hallway, working his way in. He's seen the shining ceilings and roofs of gold. It's an incredible thing, but he has come here for a purpose. This is a man who believes himself to be wise, and this is a man who is seeking great wisdom and is seeking to see whether the gods are actually as wise as they're purported to be. And so, as often happens in these stories, this is a premise for much of the poems in the Elder Edda. Often, though, is Odin going out somewhere else and encountering this sort of riddling quest. But in this case, we have this human, this king. This king comes to Asgard and he challenges them to wisdom. He has questions, and he's going to see if he can defeat them by his questions. And what this lends itself to is this ongoing series of questions where the king asks the threefold council, what is X? And then they respond. And that is the structure of the rest of this work.
In mine, the 3 gods, high, just as high, and third, they agree to answer the questions. They say yes. If you ask wisely, then you will leave unharmed. So he has a role in this as well. It's not just free access. Come ask us questions.
Yeah.
He has to do so wisely. And he starts with the question, who is the highest and oldest of all gods?
And they kind of duck this one a little. They say it's All-Father, which basically is, the highest of the gods is the highest of the gods, the first father. But then they do go on to a significant list of names. Mm-hmm. And what you can see is that this individual god does not go by a significant name. So the significant list of names, so Har, right, High, is the one who answers this. All-Father he is called in our tongue, but in Asgard of old he had 12 names. The first is All-Father, the second is Heren or Herjon, the third Nikar or Henikar, the fourth, Nikus or Henikud, the fifth, Fjolnir, the sixth, Oske, the seventh, Ome, the eighth, Befilda or Beflinda, the ninth, Svirar, the 10th, Vidrer, the 11th, Vidrer, the 12th, Yolg or Yolk. I mean, that's a lot of names. You can see where people can get intimidated by this book, because if you were reading this thinking, oh, I got to remember all those, you don't. Just move on.
I don't have a problem with that. But it's the number of stories in it that is overwhelming to me, but they're so good. So the next question he asks, though, is where is he and what powers does he have? What big stuff did he do? And here's interesting because all 3 answer. He lives throughout all time. He made heaven and earth, everything in them. And then the third says, his greatest work is that he made man and gave him a soul that shall live and never perish through the body decay, though the body decay to dust or burn to ashes.
Yeah. And here we also start to get a little bit of the cosmology of the Norse world, as well as, we've used this term in the past, eschatology, what happens kind of in the end. And so he says here, all who live in life of virtue shall dwell with him in Gimli or Vingolf. The wicked, on the other hand, go to hell, and from her to Niflhel, that is down into the ninth world. And this starts prompting questions about cosmology.
I like this. What was he doing before he did all that?
Har gave answer. Then was he with the frost giants.
And here we go. What was the beginning? And how did things start? And what was there before? And here, Hai quotes the Völuspá. So I asked you about the Völuspá earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the Völuspá.
The Völuspá is one of the poems of the Elder Edda. And in it, Odin is the one traveling. He is the one that goes to seek wisdom from a vulva. A vulva is a witch is too simple a term, but a wise woman, somebody who knows things. And Odin is always trying to learn more. And so in that story, he is in the role of Ganglir, and he's the one who goes and asks questions of the vulva.
Interesting mind, because Allfather is one of Odin's names. But that they don't name Odin when they say who is the greatest of all the gods.
Mm-hmm.
But he is called Allfather. Explain it to me. I got confused by that. I thought they meant Odin.
They do mean Odin.
But it's not even one of the 12 names.
No, weird, huh?
Oh, that's confusing.
This is something that often comes up for those of us who are moderns, especially for those of us who have lived in a world where Christianity has been the dominant faith process for the last 2,000 years. Now, I am a Christian. I love Christianity. I think it is the right one, but it is a different way of looking at the world and religion specifically than you get in the pagans. To the pagans, theology was not a thing. It wasn't really important that everybody agreed on exactly the names of Odin's or even the stories of him. It didn't matter if Zeus had multiple names and was actually a different god in one location or another location. What mattered was what you did, that you were following religious protocol. But what you were always trying to do, or what many people were trying to do, was to learn more about this unseen realm, this world of the gods that was beyond us. They were trying to gather more wisdom and knowledge. What that meant, though, was that you did not have a uniform theology. And so the same God could have a zillion names and could have full-on contradictory properties. The same God could be totally different from one story to another. So don't let it bother you if you run into something like this. Odin is the Allfather. That's how we've come to know him in these stories. But there's even arguments whether he was always the high God. He probably was not. And so there is these kind of fluctuations, which if you're looking for something hard and fast, right? Christian theology tends to be pretty hard and fast, right? We have the Nicene Creed. They don't have the same sort of thing in pagan worship.
That's interesting. It's a little more, I don't know, just a little more fluid, I guess.
Very much so, yes.
I guess that would lead to fewer questions about, things reconciling.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have the theological questions that you do inside of Christianity that are often a hang-up for people in their faith, or can be.
Because in Christianity, we are very outspoken about this. The idea that in the beginning was the Word and the Word was God. That word is logos, right? It is logic, reason, rationality itself. Because of that, we as Christians believe that the entire created universe is rational, that it follows rules and laws, and therefore contradiction is outside of the very nature of God and his design. He is not a God of disorder, but a God of order. Now, let's imagine Christianity was nonsense and the world was just whatever the world was. There's no reason why it had to make sense. There's no reason why it had to exist without contradiction, without order. The only reason that's the case is because we follow a good God and a loving God of order. They don't necessarily do. And in fact, the world doesn't start out of order. It starts out of chaos, conflict, ice, and venom. That's a very different way of pursuing the divine than the way we do it in the Christian world.
Here he's asking about the beginning. How did it all start? And it says in the Voluspa, it was at the beginning of time when nothing was. Sand was not, nor sea, nor cool waves. Earth did not exist, nor heaven on high. The mighty gap was, but no growth. And it talks about the passage of time and how these things develop. First, there was the world in the southern region called Muspel. It is bright and hot. That area is flaming and burning and impassable for those that are foreigners there and not native to it. And it describes gods. They're not gods. They're frost giants.
Yeah, and again, this is so different from the way we as Christians view creation and view the beginning of the world. First of all, we as Christians and the Jews before us had this concept that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. So this has really come up with into a Latin phrase, right, that he created ex nihilo, that God created out of nothing, that there was nothing but the eternal, ever-present, essential God, but that he then created outside of that. That's not what you see here. The beginning of the Norse cosmology is not nothing. There are things that existed before Midgard. There are things that existed before our world. And in particular, he mentions three as he goes through this. So, Muspelheim, right? This world of fire, this world of light and brightness and fire. And then Niflheim, which is fogland, this freezing world of cold and mist and water and fog. And then you have Ginnungagap. You have this great chasm between them. And this is where you start to see a connection between the world of fog and ice and the world of fire. And you get this melting and you get this ice structure with this venom and poison dripping off of it. It is a dark beginning, but this thing that forms becomes Ymir. This becomes the first of the frost giants. And it's interesting because he asked pretty quickly after this, so is he a god? And the answer is no.
That's true.
So he is evil. All the evil things came from him. We do not worship him, but he was in the beginning between Muspelheim and Niflheim.
It says all giants came from Ymir.
Yes.
So there are sibyls, there are wizards, there are sorcerers, all given a place that they come from, and all giants from Ymir come.
Yes. There is one other thing that exists here that they don't tell us where it comes from.
The cow?
The cow! What the heck? Why is there a cow there? Well, the cow is licking the ice. The rime. Isn't that a wonderful word? The rime. And as the cow licks the rime, things start to appear, including the first, it says man here, but this is really the first of the gods. Buri, who begot a son named Bor. And out of him came the first of the gods, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Licked by a cow.
They ask, what does the cow feed on? He's like, well, clearly it licks the salt. That's the rhyme. And then these creatures come from it. I remember in like middle school, a teacher talking about this giant Nordic cow that sourced all people. Like, where did it come from? But they do have questions about what it eats and its milk. So some questions still out there. Like you say, it doesn't have to make total rational sense.
Where does this cow come from? I wonder.
So yes, Odin is one of the three born. And the king, asking the questions, asks, how did they get on together, these siblings? Which was the most powerful? This is a recurring thing, like who's the best? Who's the biggest? Who's the most powerful? Well, it's Odin.
Clearly. But he and his brothers step up and they do something incredibly powerful right here. They kill Ymir. They kill the frost giant. And it is said that when they kill him, the blood of the giant leaks out and it drowns all the other frost giants except one. This is fascinating to me because you have this cataclysmic flood that kills all frost giants except for one and his wife, Berglemir, who stays alive on an ark. You have an inverted Noah story. You have the salvation of the evil ones that then propagate all the other frost giants or antigods that exist ever after this. Again, I don't really know what that means, but it's fascinating.
It does say that they use the body of Ymir, this frost giant, basically it constructs the world. You talked about this one again in the monster mashup, where all the world is made from the body of this, in my mind, massive frost giant. So I believe his flesh is the earth, his blood is the sea, bones are the mountains, his skull is the sky, and his brain are the clouds.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this is where we live.
I'm baffled by this.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole thing.
It's so different and it's so fascinating. It's really interesting. Well, again, they talk through how everything is made, but creation continues on after this point too. And so it goes into now the creation of man. How did the human race exist? And the answer here is very clear. Driftwood. Driftwood picked up off the ocean. The two names of the man and the woman, Ask and Embla. And this is another one where, again, there's a lot of argument and debate. We don't really know what these names mean. Most people associate Ask with the ash tree, the idea that this chunk of driftwood that floated up and then was given life by Odin and his brothers is the ash tree. Now, that's fascinating because we're also about to learn about Yggdrasil, the great world ash tree. And so there is this concept even here that there is a component of the human race that is linked with the divine tree that connects the 9 realms, that connects all of creation, which is interesting if that's really what Ask means. Embla, I couldn't come up with a similar agreement. Like I say, most people seem to be on board with the Ask thing. With Embla, I've heard it translated elm. I've heard it translated vine. I've seen it translated water pot. And I don't know which is right. But these then become the first humans, Ask and Embla.
It reminds me of Watership Down, Emblir. As a rabbit word.
Yeah. That one's not as nice, though.
No, that's kind of rabbit profanity.
Yeah, that would mean stinking, as I recall.
That's right. Wait, before we move on, the winds. So there are 4 points at the corners of the earth, and under each corner they set a dwarf, and these are the winds, and I believe they hold up the sky. There's a lot with molten particles and sparks. That's how mine is translated, which is super cool. But yes, I think the names are cool. You don't have to remember them all, but Austri, Vestri, Nordri, and Sudri.
Yeah.
Cool.
And again, we are skipping over a ton here. It may seem like we're going slowly, but we are not.
Nope.
There is a lot here that we're passing over. I mean, and part of this is some of these get mentioned in more detail in later stories. So like here is also where we learn about the crafting of the sun and the moon, these chariots, but that they're also being chased, and that's why they keep going. And again, these are all based off of responses to questions that Ganglier asks. So why is the sun being chased? Why is the moon being chased? And we learn here first of the wolves, Skoll and Hati, that are chasing the sun and the moon and are destined to someday catch them. And again, it refers back. I think we've actually referred to this passage from the Voluspa multiple times. In the east dwells the old hag in the Yarnved forest and brings forth their Fenrir's offspring. Devourer in a troll's disguise. He is filled with the lifeblood of men doomed to die. The seats of the gods he stains with red gore. And again, these are quotes from these older poems. And so there's not a lot happy about the Norse cosmos. Even the gods are doomed. And the sun and the moon are doomed. And that is known here by the gods in answer to Ganglir's questions.
It's true. Even the clouds. So the clouds that come from the body of Ymir, they call them the cruel clouds. Everything, the rime is poison. The sparks are hot and molten. They're burning, and they become the stars. I mean, it is a fairly dark feeling view of creation.
Yeah. But you understand where strength becomes so important. The ability to fight, because this is a hard world, and if you're going to survive it, you must be strong. And that flavor really permeates this entire story of creation. Again, we're skipping over a bunch here, but I don't think we can leave this portion without talking about the Bifrost. The Bifrost is the great bridge of the gods. This is what links earth to heaven. That's Ganglir's question. What is the path from earth to heaven? And I love that there's a back and forth with these questions and a lot of belittling and teasing that occurs. So to this question, Har answered laughingly, "Foolishly do you now ask. Have you not been told that the gods made a bridge from earth to heaven, which is called the Bifrost?" So again, you fool. Shouldn't you know this already?
Mine says, you must have seen it. Maybe it is what you call the rainbow. It has 3 colors. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It has lots more.
This is interesting. I was listening to a lecture on Norse mythology, and the guy was talking about, we haven't gotten to Hel yet. Hel is a character in this cosmology, but she is described as being half flesh-colored and half blue. But what he says is that there were only actually a couple colors in Old Norse, and blue includes things like indigo and violet and purple. And so it would make sense that as they describe the 3 colors of the rainbow, several of those colors, they would all just be blue.
The Rainbow Bridge, that's what people tell your kids when a cat or dog dies, across the Rainbow Bridge. I've heard that phrase. Here it's the Bifrost. It is the bridge from heaven to earth and both ways. And the king is like, doesn't seem to me that the gods built the bridge in good faith if it's liable to break, considering that they can do as they please. And the High says the gods are not deserving of blame for this work. Bifrost is a good bridge, but there's nothing in this world that will be secure when Muspel's sons attack.
And we're going to get very specifically into Ragnarok later, but it permeates all these tales and all these stories. So the sons of Muspel, remember, what was Muspel? Muspelheim was that realm, that world that existed before the earth that was full of fire. But not like pleasant, I'm going to sit by the fire and warm myself. This is destructive fire. This is violence. This is the volcano. This is all that is bright and hot and burning. And so the sons from this land, when they come to fight, it's the end of the world.
And so by Muspel's sons, that just means everyone's in the fight, right? So it'll be gods and anti-gods.
It will be gods and anti-gods. There's specifically some of Muspel's sons that get referenced later. Surt is the big one.
He had the flaming sword.
He does. So what moves in next is a description of the golden age of the gods. So they built this place where they can judge between men and other gods. And this is also where we first meet the dwarves. Now, this is not a noble beginning to this race. The dwarves are said to have grown from the maggots in Ymir's flesh. So remember that frost giant that is now the world after he was killed? Well, maggots grew out of his flesh, and these became the dwarves. But it says that the gods decided to give them man shape and understanding. And so they are given essentially life by the gods. And the dwarves show up over and over and over. And I want to just read another quote that comes from the Vala's prophecy, the Voluspa, or at least I believe that's where this one comes from. It's a list of the dwarven names. So I'm going to read this, and there's some things that I think may stand out to the modern reader. Dvalin, Dain, Biffer, Baffer, Bomber, Norli, Orli, Onar, Owen, Vig, Gandalf, Vindalf, Thorin, Fili, Kili, Fundin, Vale, Dore, Oire. I mean, what do you hear there?
Gimli's in there as well, but in a different list. So if you've ever read The Hobbit, if you ever read Lord of the Rings, all the names are in there, including Gandalf. Yeah. Gandalf was a dwarf.
Yeah, and sometimes even in order. I mean, the line of, Biffer Bomber, I loved this the first time I read it because I think a lot of us read this the first time and go, that's where they came from.
Yeah.
That's where he got the names. And it's just so exciting.
Even Bomber,
who is very fat.
That's exactly. All the Hobbit dwarves are here. And Gandalf. Even Thorin.
Yeah.
Thror. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's Throin in mine. But his dad, Thrain, is in here as well somewhere. So all those names that Tolkien came up with, they are literally from the Younger Edda. Mm-hmm. It did blow my mind, especially that Gandalf was in the dwarf list.
That one surprised me too.
Because sorcerers were mentioned earlier. He's in the dwarf list.
Now, the dwarves in Norse mythology are interesting. They show up a lot. They're going to be recurring characters. And often they are associated with the making of wonderful things. Things like Thor's hammer, right? A lot of these great things that are constructed or made are made by the dwarves. But there are also elves in Norse mythology. and cue the debate about whether dwarves and elves are the same thing, whether they're different things. There's a lot that we still just don't know about what was actually believed about these various races.
When we get to elves in this, in your translation, I'd be curious because mine has lots of mention of dwarves. I don't remember elves.
There are very few, actually. Very, very few. And actually, the elves are often spoken of more in the sagas than the Eddas. So we're actually not going to come across much in terms of the elves in here. And that's kind of why, though, there's the argument.
Why wouldn't they be separate? Tell me more about that. I don't know about this.
Because there are places where the same creature gets referred to as both.
Like an elf dwarf?
Yes. In one line, he gets an elf, and another, he's dwarf. It would be if we were to describe somebody in one passage as a fairy, and then in the next as an elf. So could they be different? Sure. Could they be the same? Maybe. And I just don't know.
Interesting. So that means maybe Tolkien like spliced them out to make different kinds of things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very much Middle Earth, right? Dwarves aren't the same.
Correct.
But maybe he pulled them separately. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And I do think that's an important thing to know when reading through Norse literature. As much as I love Tolkien, it's impossible for me to see the word dwarf and not think about Tolkien's dwarves. It's also very hard for me to see the word elf and not think about Tolkien's elves. But I think he would be the first to tell you that they're entirely different. They're something he made up. They're a creation for his stories. And yes, he took names, and yes, he took characteristics, but they are not the same thing. Dwarves in this are not necessarily short, right? Elves are not necessarily tall and beautiful. And so it's a different cosmology. It's a different world building than Tolkien did.
All right. Next question up is, where is the chief center or holy place of the gods? And Hai says, it is at the Ash Yggdrasil. Did I say it right?
I don't know how to say anything right.
Yggdrasil. It's a cool word.
You just throw yourself at Yggdrasil.
There the gods must hold their courts each day. So is this ash tree, this world tree, is it part of Asgard?
No. Asgard is part of the world tree.
Okay.
One of the roots of the tree runs under the land of the gods, but the roots also run under the other lands. They talk about the 9 worlds, that this world tree, Yggdrasil, includes all the 9 realms within it. That includes some we've already talked about. Niflheim, Muspelheim, Asgard. But it also includes things like Midgard and things like the Dwarven homes. I mean, so there's all these realms. A natural question, I don't think it gets asked by Gangler, is, well, what are the 9 realms? There are not a specific 9 realms iterated. You can come up with a number of them, but this is a good place to talk about the fact that 9 is a recurring number in Norse mythology. All mythologies have numbers that are of particular importance, and 9 is a big one in Norse. So the fact that there are 9 realms is important because it speaks to the power of that number, but exactly what the 9 realms are, again, there's debate about that topic.
Under the root of the tree, the ash tree that reaches towards the frost giants, there is where Mimir's well is, which has wisdom and intelligence contained in it, and the master of the well is called Mimir. He is full of learning because he drinks of the well. Allfather went there, Odin went there, and asked for a single drink from the well, but he did not get one until he placed his eye as a pledge. Here is where you have one-eyed Odin. I have heard that reference.
He traded his eye for wisdom. And I can't remember it's written, and I should know, but there's more to the story than that. Well, we're going to learn more about the story as this goes on because it gets referenced a lot, not just the pledging of the eye, not just him seeking Mimir's well for wisdom, but also the hanging on the tree. Odin says somewhere in the literature that he hung on a tree, an offering to himself for 9 days for this wisdom. So we have that number 9 again. But as a Christian reading this, a divine figure hanging on a tree as an offering to himself, interesting. Again, I don't want to go too far out on what exactly that means, but you can think about that for a while.
Yeah, echoes. Feels like echoes.
There's more to say about the tree, stories and tales about the tree. I'm just going to read my translation here. Then said Gangler, what other remarkable things are there to be said about the ash? Har answered, much is to be said about it. On one of the boughs of the ash sits an eagle who knows many things. Between his eyes sits a hawk that is called Vedfolnir. A squirrel by name Ratatosk springs up and down the tree and carries words of envy between the eagle and Nidhugg. 4 stags leap about in the branches of the ash and bite the leaves. I mean, there's a lot of wildlife going on in this tree, and most of it are pretty mean to it. He cites another poem here underneath. The ash Yggdrasil bears distress greater than men know. Stags bite it above. At the side it rots. Nidhugg gnaws it below, and so again it is said, more serpents lie neath the Yggdrasil ash than is thought of by every foolish ape. So the very bones of creation, the world tree that binds everything together, is in a state of rot and in a state of siege. All these creatures attacking it. This is not a happy mythology.
Yeah, mine uses the word gnaws a lot. Eats away at it, gnaws away. It's rotting away. It's also drenched with mud, so it has this stain above it. But it says that this tree, this high holy tree, stands for evergreen above Weird's Well. What is Weird's Well?
So this is a fountain of kind of good and light and sparkle. And so there are those who are helping to take care of the tree against those that are seeking to destroy the tree. In this next passage, I guess this is where the elves do get mentioned because, again, we're talking about the different worlds. And he talks about Alfheim, right, the home of the elves. There dwell the folk that are called light elves, but the dark elves dwell down in the earth, and they are unlike the light elves in appearance, but much more so in deeds. The light elves are fairer than the sun to look upon, but the dark elves are blacker than pitch. So again, are the black elves dwarves? I don't know.
In Narnia, don't they have black elves? There's black elves and red elves. No, sorry, dwarves.
The dwarves, yeah. You're thinking about Nickabrick.
Yes.
And Trumpkin from Prince Caspian. The Nords are fascinating. So there are 3 kind of main Nords who determine the fates of men, but then every man also has other Nords. So there are other unnamed Nords. The Nords don't really get described as goddesses, but they're not human. And again, it's a big world. There's all sorts of things in this that don't necessarily neatly fall into different categories.
Ganglery here asks, what will protect this place when Surt's fire burns heaven and earth? And the response is really interesting. Hai says, they say there is another heaven south of and above this heaven of ours, and that heaven is called Andlang, and that there is a third heaven still further above that one, and that is called Vidblain. And it is in that heaven that we believe this place to be. But we believe it is only light elves that inhabit these places for the time being. And then they jump to the wind. Like, that did not seem satisfactory to me. I wanted more.
Yeah, you're not going to get more.
About these layers of heaven, and they think they're in the third one. And to me, this part especially, it indicates that kind of cyclical nature. So, because there are all these references to the gnawing away and the whole structure being slowly destroyed and building towards this ending, but that's not all there is, because there's these other heavens, these other iterations. But yeah, they just really shut that one down. Like, wait, what about the wind?
And honestly, I'm not sure how much they knew about it. I mean, how much they really believed about those things. And so all we've got is what's in the text, and so I don't know any more than that.
Well, there's a cool, huge eagle who flaps his wings, and that's what makes the winds and blows ships around.
Hrasvelg. He's pretty awesome.
There's questions about the weather. Why do we have warm summers and cold winters? They disparage him here. Like, a wise man shouldn't have to ask that question.
Yeah, that's right. Come on, man. Come up with something better. Come up with something good. And then he goes into the Aesas. And at this point, we actually get more names and a little bit more specific. I'm not going to dwell too much on each of these because most of these we come to know later on through stories. But we can talk through some of these kind of individually, so we've at least heard the names. Odin and Frigg are the 2 high gods, or the god and the goddess, right? Frigg is Odin's wife. Odin classically lives in Valhall with all the warriors, the heroes that die. Odin is a war god. He is a god who seeks the slain in battle to come live with him, to fight for him at Ragnarok. And again, many more of these stories are going to come up as we progress through the Edda. Thor, of course, is by far the most popular god ever. And there's a lot of debate about who was the higher god, Odin or Thor. Odin, definitely a lot more aristocratic, a lot more the god of the wealthy and the nobles. Thor, very much more the everyman. So the just the powerful, the strong, the angry. He drives a chariot drawn by 2 goats that he can eat and then bring back to life with his hammer, which is pretty delightful. And he's got 3 kind of gifts, 3 things that are associated with him. He has, of course, his hammer, Mjolnir. He has his great belt of strength, Meginjörður. And he has his iron gloves. Mine doesn't give a fun translation or name for iron gloves. Does yours?
Yeah. No name for the gloves.
Just says his iron gloves.
It is funny. The king who's asking questions, he's like, what a terrible lot of names you have. Like, what does he say? He says, by my faith, one would need a great deal of learning to be able to give details and explanations for all these events and people. He gets lost in the names too.
That's right. Well, but that's the point, right? He's coming seeking learning and he's getting overwhelmed. But the gods are not overwhelmed by this. They just know this stuff. Going down through the list of names, Balder gets mentioned, and he basically just gets mentioned as being awesome. And we're going to come back to Balder in the future. We then have Njord. And let's talk about Njord for a moment, because he is described as, depending on the translation, one of the Van gods or a Vanjar. Have you ever heard of that? Does that distinction make sense to you?
No, but I think just when you said it there, the word vanguard came up. Does that have any association?
I don't know if it does or not. So we've been talking about the Aesir, right? The Asa gods. But this is where we learn that those are not the only gods. We have the gods, we have the Jotun, the anti-gods, the frost giants. But then there's this whole other race of gods called the Vanjar. And Njord is one of the Vanjar. And so what you have at some point are multiple sets of gods, and somehow there has been a rapprochement between the two, where they have come together. And so Njord has gone to live among the Asa. And it's said that there's actually an Asa god who has gone to live among the Vanir. Njord is counted as one of the gods here, but he's an outsider. But he is also the father, through the giantess Skadi, of 2 of the most important of the Norse gods and goddesses, Frey and Freya, or as I've heard them pronounced, Frøy and Froya. So Frey and Freya are the children of Njord. They're not Asa. They are Vanir gods and goddesses, but they are beloved. Frey is a god of light, and Freya is a goddess of love. And they come from not Asa, from the Vanir. Interesting.
What I know about Njord is he has beautiful feet.
Oh, yes. And that story will come up.
So I think it's in the Skaldskaparmal.
It is.
Just know that there are stories about each of these as you progress through. So this is a buildup of information about all of these characters and these stories, and then we get to hear the stories about them. So yes Njord, beautiful feet. And we learn later.
It will be important. Well, I mentioned Frey and Freya. I'm going to mention briefly Tyr or Tiw. He is a war god and is closely linked with Fenrir the wolf. And again, wonderful stories we're going to come to. We have Brage, the skald, the poet, and he is married to Idun. Idun is one of my favorites because she is the goddess of the apples. These are the apples that keep the gods young. If they don't consistently eat of these apples, they get old and withered. So she is so important because if anything were to happen to her and her apples, the gods would literally get old and die.
So if you're getting overwhelmed with names, here, the god High, he starts laughing and he's talking about Idun. He says, it nearly led to a disaster on one occasion. I could tell you about that. But first, you must hear the names of some more Aesir. Mm-hmm. Even here, they're like, we're going to get to the stories, but you need more people first, more names.
And this is, I think, what Snorri is trying to do. Here's the background. You need to know this, and then you can love the stories. And then the stories will help you remember these names. But if you don't know the names and their associations, you can't really appreciate the stories. Mm-hmm. And again, we are running through these quickly, but there's going to be more stories down the line on almost all of these. Heimdall is the next one. Heimdall is the guardian of the gods. He is famously born of 9 women. He has 9 mothers. Again, that number 9. We have Hodir, the blind god, who plays such an important part in one of the stories. We have Vidar, the son of Odin, who says he has a very thick shoe. It doesn't elaborate on it here, but again, these are teasers, and this will become important. And then we have Ale, or Vale, who it doesn't say really anything about, other than that he is daring in combat and a good shot. Now, I don't know any stories about him, but he's listed among these major gods, and it's similar with Uller. Uller, it says, is a good archer, and he's fast on skis, and that's all we know about him. And then finally is Forsetta, the son of Balder and Nanna, and he is given credit. This is actually, I think we should know him better than we do. He's just not in the stories, but it says that he is a reconciler of dispute. So he is like the ultimate arbitrator, where people can go to him and walk away reconciled. That's a god that they should be paying more attention to, I think.
Yeah, that might help them.
Well, after that whirlwind of the gods, there's one more who, if I were to list the most famous of the Norse gods, Odin and Thor, of course, would be on the top of the list, but right next to them would be Loki.
Mine calls him originator of deceits.
I find him to be in many ways the most fascinating of the Norse pantheon because he has these strange dual roles. He is the god of mischief, the god of trouble, but on such wildly divergent scales. I mean, sometimes he's just comic relief. I mean, it's kind of like buddy cop movies where he's the goofy partner always getting into trouble. But in other times, he is literally bringing about the destruction of creation. I mean, there's this strange scale to him, and he shows up in so many of the stories, and so many of the stories are because of his troublemaking and his instigating. And there's a whole chapter in my version of this devoted to Loki, but not just Loki, Loki and his offspring. And we've talked about these before.
I think Loki gets bored. They talk about how he's cunning, he's got tricks for every purpose. He does have a wife and children. And yes, his children are all extreme. Again, this came up on our monster mashup. There's a lot about Loki's children in that.
Oh, yeah. Well, because it's fascinating, and they are so intricately tied to the stories of the gods, the creation of the world, and the destruction of the world. But before we talk about his children, let's talk about his parentage. So Loki is the son of the giant Farbot, and his mother is Laufey, or sometimes Null. Laufey or Null. And again, those who watch the Marvel movies, Loki is not the son of Odin. In the Marvel movies, Loki is the adopted son of Odin, but is actually the son of Laufey, the king of the frost giants. Well, Laufey is a girl. Laufey is his mom, not the king of the frost giants in the original sources. He has a wife, Sigyn, but he also has multiple extramarital encounters, and probably the most important and the most famous is with the frost giant woman, Angrboda. And it is with this woman that he has his 3 most famous offspring. Fenris, the wolf, Jormungandr, the world serpent, and Hel.
When the gods realized that these 3 siblings were being brought up in giant land, and when the gods traced prophecies stating that from these siblings great mischief and disaster would arise, then they all felt evil was to be expected from them, to begin with because of their mother's nature, but still worse because of their fathers. So these are children of a giant, an anti-god, and Loki. It says Loki's pleasing and handsome in appearance, but evil in character. And he has these 3 monstrous children.
And we're going to talk about each of these 3 in their turn as the stories progress. But real briefly, Fenris is the great wolf who ends up being chained. And is a wonderful passage that describes this. This is where the bravery of Tyr comes in, because Fenris refuses to submit to the chain unless a god is willing to put his hand in his mouth. And Tyr does so. The wolf is chained, and it says, all the gods laugh except for Tyr, because he has lost his hand. and so he will forever be the one-handed god after that encounter. Jormungandr, again, is the world serpent, the great serpent that circles the world and bites his own tail, and shows up in several stories, especially related to Thor, and will be there at Ragnarok with Fenris. And then Hel is interesting, because Hel, the daughter of Loki, Odin actually gives a job, and she becomes the keeper and the queen of the dead. And so this we see in countless mythologies where the name of the dead is actually identical to the ruler of it. So Hel is a place, that's where the dead go, but it's also the ruler of the dead. And she's described in horrific ways, right? Being half flesh colored and half blue, or like decomposing like a dead body. So we see this also in things like Hades with the Greeks, where it's the land or it's the king. And this very much has a similar feel to even like Sheol in old Hebrew literature. And so Fenris, Jormungandr, and Hel, very, very important roles and will show up a lot.
Hel is spooky, actually, because she has to administer board and lodging to those sent to her, and that is those who die of sickness or old age. And they describe her great mansions where she houses them and gives them room and board. But her dish is hunger, her knife famine. Her threshold where you enter, stumbling block. Her bed, sickbed. Her curtains, gleaming bale. Very bleak.
Yes.
And these aren't even terrible people. These are people who die of sickness or old age. What hope is that?
Not a lot.
Oh, terrible.
Not a lot. Well, again, Loki and his offspring are going to come back over and over in the stories. We're laying the groundwork here, and Snorri is laying the groundwork here so we can appreciate the stories. The next thing he moves into are the goddesses, and he doesn't spend a lot of time on the goddesses. Frigg and Freya and Idun are the ones that are most commonly showed up in the stories. There's, again, debate about all this. There's actually a lot of argument about whether Frigg and Freya are the same person. There can be an argument to make that so, but usually they're considered as different.
With Frigg, I thought, this might happen later, I can't remember, but it describes her as highest among the goddesses and that she can prophesy. She knows fate, but doesn't speak. And again, I think that's inconsistent. She does sometimes, but that she knows about prophecy. She can see the future, but she will not speak it is an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, and she is the wife of Odin, so it makes sense in this world where knowledge is so important, where all these kings and heroes are willing to travel to, these different realms just to discover knowledge. It makes sense that the Queen of the Gods would have that knowledge within herself. I mean, that kind of justifies her queenship. In this chapter, there's not a lot in here, but we do get mentioned the Valkyries, and the Valkyries are just fascinating. There's a whole list of names of these, and it says these are called Valkyries. Odin sends them to all battles where they choose those who are to be slain and rule over the victory. Really interesting. The Valkyries are not warriors so much in their own right. They're the choosers of the slain. And so they have this really important role in battle. There's a whole other group of women in Norse literature that are called the Shield Maidens, and sometimes those get confused with the Valkyries, but they're actually quite different. Probably the most famous of the Valkyries of just Brynhilde in the Nibelungheid saga, but just incredible. The Valkyries, they're cool. So we have just spoken a lot of very confusing words and said a lot of names incorrectly to try and help prep us for the beginning of stories. And here we have, in some ways, one of the first of the stories that gets told. This is the story of the giantess Gerd and Skirnir's journey. This is actually the story, though, of Frey, one of the great gods of the Norse, and how he loses his sword. The story goes that there was an anti-god, a giantess, who was the most beautiful creature ever. And this was Gerd. It says that Frey was standing where the Allfather normally sits and can see out over all the worlds. And it says, as a punishment for his audacity, Frey went away full of grief because he saw this woman, this giantess, and he longed for her and he wanted her. And Frey was so despondent that he wouldn't speak, he wouldn't drink, he wouldn't eat. And his father, Njord, sent for his servant Skirnir. And he got the story out of him. Why are you so depressed? And he says he's longing for this woman. And so Skirnir gets sent to Jotunheim, where this woman is, to ask for her in marriage for his master. But the only way that this deal can be made is if Frey agrees to give up his sword. And of course, it's a magical sword that'll fight on its own. But Frey doesn't think twice about this. He's happy to give up the sword. But much like in dreams, sometimes when things happen in these stories, you only get one shot at it. So now that he has given up his sword, he doesn't go find another one. He is now unarmed. And so he will go to Ragnarok without his sword because he traded it to marry the giantess, Gerd. It's an incredible story. It's short, it's beautiful, but this is the sort of thing that you couldn't really understand this until you knew who Frey was, until you knew who Nord was, until you knew what the Jotnar are. Once you know those, you get this glimpse. And then we've had all this foreshadowing of Ragnarok, and now we know Frey is going to go to it unarmed. And this is where the web of story starts to grow.
I like that the king, though, he asks about what people eat in Valhalla.
And so now we bounce back to world building.
He just got this whole insight into Frey and being unarmed at the end of the world when the Muspel's sons come and wage war. And he's like, well, what does Odin feed them? What does he got to offer them for food in Valhalla? I think this sequence is hilarious. Actually, several times in this.
Yeah, agreed. But he's got answers. Yeah. There's this regenerating boar that they can feast on all day, and then by the next day is back to what it was. There's this goat that can basically give them mead nonstop. And so basically they get to eat and drink and fight. That's what they do. The heroes that are in Valhalla eat and drink and fight, and then the next day they do it again, and they're going to keep doing it again until Ragnarok, and they all think this is awesome.
Yeah. Well, and there's questions. Does Odin have to eat the same thing? He's like, no, wine's enough for him. It is both drink and meat for Odin.
And that does speak to Odin being a god of the aristocracy, of the high class, because the peasants are not getting wine, not in Iceland. And so the fact that he can drink wine where everyone else is drinking, mead and beer, shows his stature, his status.
And we learn here that Odin has 2 ravens that sit on his shoulders. And I think these are super cool. They sit on his shoulders and speak into his ear all the news they see or hear. You said earlier, Odin's always looking for wisdom. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's particularly true in the Voluspa, where he's the questioner. But here that he's these ravens to fly around, gather news, and bring it back to him. He is always investigating, always learning.
And this is so cool. Odin is clearly associated with ravens. He's referred to as well as a Hrafnagud, or raven god. But these 2 ravens have names. They're Hugin and Munin. And Hugin and Munin mean thought and memory. Mm. And so he sends his thought out of the world and his memory, and it comes back to him. And there's this fascinating poetry quote that gets inserted here as well that says, Hugin and Munin fly every day over the great earth. I fear for Hugin that he may not return, yet more am I anxious for Munin. You can imagine you're getting older, right? We worry if we can't calculate a tip or remember how to spell something.
What's the word, thought.
Yeah. But what we really worry about is that insidious dementia, right? That onset of, I don't remember anything. Mm-hmm. So the memory, even people who have advanced dementia, you can often talk with them. The thought is there, but the memory is gone. And we see that embedded in this at least 800-year-old text.
They're talking about how awesome Odin is and all these things about him and about Valhalla, where the people live and how many people there are living there. And it's just amazing, right? How they drink his, I think it's from the horn of a goat or something. And the ability to drink much, like a draft, is prowess in this culture.
Yeah. How manly are you?
I don't think it matters exactly if it's alcohol or water, but your just ability to drink volume is a matter of prestige. But here they are also talking about the best of things.
Yeah, all sorts of best of things. And there are these poems, these lists. So, well, here's one. It says, The Yggdrasil ash is the foremost of trees, but Skidbladner of ships, Odin of aces, Sleipnir of steeds, Bifrost of bridges, Bragi of skulls, Hobrock of hows, but Garm of dogs. Garm's back!
Go listen to Farmer Giles of Ham, which was excellent. Garm is the name of the dog. I was shocked to learn in this that he is opposed to the gods, though. At Ragnarok, he fights for the other side.
Yeah, I think it's Garm that actually takes out Tyr.
Yeah.
Tyr and Garm are the two that fight at Ragnarok. But the Garm in Sir Giles of Ham is wonderful. We love him. Well, and this naturally leads into these great things because we've just mentioned Sleipnir and we've mentioned Skinbladner. And so Gangler asks, whose is that horse Sleipnir and what is there to say about it? Well, there's quite a bit to say about that horse. And again, here is a story that gets inserted. And this one is fun. So this takes place when Asgard has been built, but the walls aren't around it yet. So this is still early days. And a giant comes up to Odin and all the gods and offers to build the walls around Asgard to make it so strong that none of the Jotnar will ever be able to get into it. Well, this is a very attractive offer. They would like these walls of defense because this is a hard world. But he demands a price, and his price is not trivial. He wants the sun, he wants the moon, and he wants Freya as his reward. Now, this is a good example. Later we learn this is a frost giant, but you can't tell that here as part of the conversation. He's just somebody who is bidding and contracting with them. And he asks for a certain amount of time to do this, and they are hesitant because of that steep price. But they're able to negotiate down to a third of the original time he asked to build the walls. Or the agreement gets proposed that he would do this building project for them, but he is not allowed to have any other man help him to do it. And if there's any part of the walls left unfinished when the time ends, then he gets nothing and he doesn't get paid back. And the guy thinks about it and he says, well, okay, I'll take the deal as long as you let me use my horse. Okay, can I use my horse in the building? And it is Loki who convinces the gods to accept this. He says, there's no way he'll be able to finish it. Let's do this. And they listen to Loki, which is always a mistake, and they take the deal. Well, this giant goes to work, and between him and his horse, this structure is flying up, and it is amazing what it is building. It is everything he promised it would be, but he is doing it quickly. And as the season is progressing, they're getting towards the end, and they're thinking he's going to finish it. And so they go after Loki. Loki was the one that talked them into it, and he said, you are going to get us out of this. And Loki says, all right, fine, I got it. I'll deal with it. And Loki comes up with a plan. And the next day, as this giant is working, a mare shows up in the forest. And the horse, who is really the one who's doing all the work, starts going after this mare. And he chases this mare into the forest, and the mare leads him around, and the giant is getting no work done. And eventually the giant realizes he's not going to finish. And it's not clear exactly what happens here in the story, but he basically exposes himself as a frost giant, at which point he is killed. And the story, you would think, would end there, except for the fact that we know that there's this mare and this amazing horse. That mare was Loki. Loki can shapeshift and does frequently in these stories. And not long after, he has a foal, which is Sleipnir. So Loki bears a horse that becomes the best of steeds and becomes the 8-legged steed of Odin. I find this fascinating on a few different levels. One is just funny and ridiculous. You like to see Loki get his comeuppance, and this is just hilarious. But the other component to this is so far the children of Loki have all been evil. They've all been dark. I mean, they've been world-ending catastrophes. Here, we have the very horse of the king of the gods. There's something good coming out of this. Again, I don't really know what to make about that, but it's interesting to me.
8-legged horse. Best of horses. I like that Thor's the enforcer. It says that he pays the builder his wages. So they were going to be the sun and the moon. They're like, no, not the sun and the moon. He didn't earn that. His wages is the hammer, Mjolnir. and struck the first blow. So his skull was shattered into fragments and sent him down beneath Niflhel.
Thor pretty much has one solution to every problem.
He really does.
I'm going to swing the hammer. If it doesn't work, I'm going to swing it harder.
Occasionally he doesn't have it. And then he's just super strong.
That's right.
That's
and angry.
Option number 2.
He's always angry. That happens.
I think in Marvel, he couldn't be angry all the time because that's too much like the Hulk.
No, in Marvel, they change his character a lot.
Very calm. And this, Thor's always flying into a rage. Very common, but he's also super strong.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's the story of Sleipnir. You'll remember he had also asked about Skidbladnir, the best of ships. And this one, there's not really a great story on here. There's a story about this later. But here we learn that this is just an amazing ship that can fit anyone who wants to get in it, but then can be folded up and put in somebody's pocket, like a napkin.
Yeah. I thought that was actually really cool, where it can hold all the Aesir. All of them together, and also you can just carry it in your pocket, mine says like a cloth, and put in one's pocket.
Yeah.
And the king who's asking questions is very impressed with that. Like, that must have been a great deal of magic. But I think the peoples who make all these things, isn't it always the dwarves?
It is the dwarves. And the making of these great treasures shows up in the later stories. Mm-hmm. Well, we are now starting to really get into the stories. We have now learned enough background that we can start talking about the stories that are loved so much. And I tell you what, if you read through the Prose Edda and can have kind of a mastery of everything in it, you will have a good grasp on most of what we know about Norse mythology and the stories. And the next realm of stories we're about to enter into are the stories regarding Thor. And these are so important and so good and so fun. But it's interesting how these start, because Gamaliel is asking these questions, and he asked, has Thor never come where he has found anything so strong and mighty that it has been superior to him, either in strength or in the black arts? And Har and the others of the council don't really want to answer this question. They think it's inappropriate to talk about where Thor fails. But Ganglier calls him out on this. He says, "But if you cannot answer my question, I declare to you to be defeated." And then answered Threda, right, the third one of the council. And he does speak, and he starts to tell stories. And these are just a whole ton of fun.
I like that third says that basically that they get, okay, we're going to tell you this, even though it's not nice for us to tell it, but don't interrupt. But you are not to interrupt, is what mine says. Listen to the whole thing.
That's right. And so Thor he's such an interesting character. The first story has him just traveling, and it's not uncommon that he's traveling along and he finds a house where he accepts hospitality or spends the night or stays with them. Often these fairly common people are peasants. And so the first story, exactly this happens. He goes and he visits the house, but they don't really have much. And he says, "Don't worry, I got this." And he kills his goats that draw his chariot. And he says, "We will eat goat tonight, just don't break any of the bones. And make sure you put all the bones back on this skin here when you're done, and then we'll be good." And so they all feast on the goats of Thor. And then in the next morning, he goes and he waves his hammer over them. And apparently his hammer has the capacity to restore the goats to full life. And they spring back up again, but one of them is lame. His back leg has been broken, and it becomes obvious that one of the children in this home has cracked the bone to suck the marrow from it, and this is why the goat is lame. Thor, of course, gets mad, which is what he does, and he starts gripping the hammer, but the people in this home ask for mercy, and they offer the reconciliation that the two young children in this home will be his servants from thereafter. Thor accepts this, and these become part of the stories moving forward. There are two of them, Thialfe, which means quick or fast or agile, and Roskava, the little girl, which means vigorous, brave, quick, and skilled. And these two become his servants and work with him, and particularly Thialfe shows up in a lot of the stories moving forward. The next story is one of the most famous about Thor. That first story I just said is a rare one where Thor doesn't kill anyone. Usually he gets angry and kills someone. This second one is one of the more famous Thor stories. And this is the story of Skrimnir and Utgard Loki. Now, the names can be confusing. You just heard me say Loki, but I'm not talking about the god Loki. Utgard Loki is a different character as part of this story. But during this story, Thor and Thjalfi and Loki, the original guy, are hanging out. They're on a journey. They're walking together. They're exploring when they decide to crawl into this cave to spend the night. And so they crawl into the cave and they're hanging out there and everything is fine until it's not. Earthquakes start happening. The cave starts shaking. They find that there's another room in the cave they can go to. And so they go into the other room. And Thor stands at the mouth of the cave of this room waiting for something bad to happen. Eventually the night ends, though. They crawl out of the cave. They're out in the sunshine. And they meet this giant. And in this case, it is a giant towards them. This is Skrimnir. He introduces himself. He's got a bag of food that's all tied up with him. And he says, basically, have you seen my glove, my mitten? They had been sleeping in it.
It had chambers. They were sleeping in the thumb of the glove. And the almost earthquake at night was the giant outside snoring. They didn't know what it was, but it was snoring.
Yeah. So, well, this is intimidating, but Thor doesn't back down from anything. And so they decide to kind of go along together for a little while. And this giant has this bag of food, which he throws down on the ground. And he says, I'm not really hungry. You can eat from my bag if you want. I'm going to take a nap. And so this giant lays down and starts snoring. Thor goes to open the bag. And again, Thor is renowned for his strength, for his power. But he cannot open this bag. He's not strong enough to untie it.
The knot is too tight for Thor.
Crazy. Thor does not accept this. And so what does Thor do? He gets angry. And so he grabs his hammer and he's going to kill this giant. And he heaves back and he crushes the giant's skull as hard as he can. And nothing happens. And the giant kind of shifts and says something like, did a breeze flow by?
I think it was a leaf. Did a leaf fall on my head?
Well, I'm going to go back to sleep. And so he does. Thor is furious. 3 times this happens. Each time he hits harder, and each time the giant refers to something trivial. I think the last one was, did a bird poop on me? It's pretty funny. And Thor is fuming, but what can he do? And the giant picks up his bag and says, I recommend if you're looking for hospitality, you go over there to the home of Utgard Loki. And then Skrimnir walks off and leaves them on their own.
He does say, he gives Thor advice. The giant says, now I'll give you some good advice. Don't act big. They don't like cheekiness. That's literally my translation. They will not easily put up with cheekiness from babies like you. He calls Thor a baby.
Yeah, this makes Thor mad.
Oh, yeah.
Everything makes Thor mad, but this definitely does. But he goes to this hall and they enter in. And what proceeds then with the master of the hall, Utgard Loki, is a series of challenges. Because the master says, you got to do something while you're here. What games will you play? And of course, he's heard of Thor. They've all heard of Thor. And so they decide, what are we going to do? Well, the first person to speak up is not Thor. It's actually Loki. Loki says, I can eat more than anyone.
They have a hot dog eating contest.
But it's this big trencher. It's this huge wooden trencher full of meat and bones. And the idea is that Loki will start at one end and the guy in the hall will start at the other end. And they're going to see where they meet. And whoever is able to consume more of this is the winner. Well, Loki is no slouch. He can eat. And he goes to town on this trencher, and he does meet his opponent in the middle. But whereas Loki has eaten the meat, the other guy has eaten the meat, the bones, and the trencher itself has all been consumed. And everyone has to acknowledge that Loki has been defeated, and so Thor's party is 0-1 in the games of Utgard Loki.
The next up is a race. How fast can you run?
And this is his servant, Thjalfi, right? The young man that had broken the goat leg. He is known to be so fast and so quick. And they end up doing 3 separate heats. And again, he is just totally defeated on each one. He runs fast, so fast, but the other runner is just so much faster. And again, Thor's party has to acknowledge defeat, and they are now 0 for 2 in this hall. Things aren't going good, but now it is time for Thor to step up. And they ask Thor, what are you going to compete in? And Thor's ready. I can drink better than any man alive. He is going to enter into a drinking contest. Well, at this point, his party has already lost a couple of these competitions. And so the master of the hall says, well, all right, fine, let's do it. I have here my drinking horn. There is no one who is such a poor drinker that he can't drain this in 3 drinks. A good drinker can do it in 2, but the best drinkers can down this drinking horn in 1 go. Thor steps up to the horn, pulls back, starts drinking, and the fluid in the horn, I don't know what it is, wine or ale or water or what's in there, I assume it's alcoholic, has not gone down at all that he can see. Thor is humiliated, but he takes another drink, this one larger and deeper, and he sees only a trivial drop in what's in the horn. And so he takes a 3rd drink, like the weak drinkers, and he pulls and drinks for as long as he can. And this time, he does see the level go down in the horn significantly, but it is not empty. And he has lost, and everyone is really kind of disappointed in him around the hall. But that's all right. Okay, you lost this one. Well, what else can you do? Well, he is renowned for his strength. But the master of the hall, though, so far is not impressed, and he says, well, I don't really want to assign you a difficult task. How about my cat? Can you lift my cat off the ground? Thor laughs. Of course I can lift the cat off the ground, but he still binds his great belt of strength around him, and he goes up to this cat, and he lifts and heaves. And as he pulls on the cat's back arches, but never comes off the ground until finally a single paw comes up as Thor is pulling with all his might. And that's it. Again, not impressing the people in this hall. Well, one more thing. Thor is angry. He wants to wrestle. And Utgard Loki is looking around saying, well, you couldn't do any of these easiest things. Who should we? Oh, you. And he pulls this little old wizened woman out of the crowd. This is so insulting, but Thor is willing to do it. And he wrestles and wrestles and wrestles and is overthrown. Thor cannot take out this old woman. And that ends the games. So Thor's party has been defeated. They've been embarrassed. They've been humiliated, but they're entertained. And so they spend the rest of the evening drinking and eating, but just fuming until the next day where they decide to leave. And so Thor and his party are now standing outside of this hall. And Thor says, well, you're going to be telling stories now about me of how weak and puny and small I am. Utgard Loki stops him and says, no. If I had any idea how strong you were, I never would have let you in my home, and you can never come back here. He says, I was Skrimnir the giant. I was the one, and through illusion, I have tricked you. Every one of those hammer strokes would have killed me, even the lightest one. But through my magic, I was able to put a mountain between my head and your hammer. And you see those valleys over there? They are no longer mountains. That would have killed me. And then when your man Loki, when he went to eat and do that contest, he was competing against fire. He still almost won, but the fire could consume everything that Loki could not with just the meat. And then when your runner went to run, he was running literally against my thought. And nothing can go faster than thought, but he almost did. And then you were the most scary of all. When you went to drink, that horn was tied to the ocean. Look out there and you will now see tides. The reason there are tides is because Thor drained the ocean in that drinking contest. And he says that cat that you lifted up the paw We all thought we were doomed when that paw went up because that wasn't a cat. That was the world serpent. That was Jormungandr that you lifted up off the floor. And the old woman that you couldn't wrestle, that was age. Nobody can out-wrestle or defeat age. And yet you fought with her for how many rounds? Says, never come back. If you do, I will trick you again because I will not let you in my home because you are too scary. And away he goes. So Thor, through this series of defeats, actually in a humorous and funny way, gained a great deal of honor in this story.
Well, the guy doesn't just walk away. Thor gets mad, grabs the hammer, and he poof, disappears.
That is Thor's move, yes.
And so he goes back home to Thrudvangar. But it says at the end, though, some foreshadowing. The fact is that he then, Thor, made up his mind to seek an opportunity for a meeting to take place between him and the serpent, as later occurred. So that's that cat that he couldn't pick up, just the one paw. Now he's got a vendetta. He's going to go after the serpent.
And he will meet the serpent more than once, but there's one more story shared here where he does get to meet the serpent again. Oh, I just gave away the ending, but here we are. This is where he goes to journey and he meets the frost giant Ymir. And as he meets them, they don't really get along, but it's decided that they're going to go fishing. Thor is going to go fishing with him in his boat. And Thor asks him, well, what are we going to use as bait? And he's basically told, deal with it, get your own.
Get your own bait.
Yeah, he solves it. He's got a solution.
It's the head of an ox, a whole ox head. He just rips it off and takes it with him as fish bait, serpent bait.
So they go out in the boat. He's got his oxen head bait, which he throws on his hook and tosses the line in, but not before there's some argument about how far out they should go. So Thor keeps rowing and Ymir keeps saying, stop, we've gone far enough. But Thor is so brave and so manly that he's going to just go further and further. And then eventually he throws out his line and he catches a big one. He's pulling and pulling, and he's pulling so hard his feet actually puncture the bottom of the boat so that he's standing on the ocean floor while pulling up this fish. But the fish he pulls up, to the horror of Ymir, is the world serpent. And so he is staring into the jaws of this creature. But Thor has got one speed. He reaches back for his hammer. And he grabs his hammer and he is ready to strike the blow on this serpent. But Ymir is so frightened, he takes out his knife and he cuts the line so that the serpent can get away, and it does. And Thor is furious that he has fished up the world serpent, that he has been denied the chance to destroy it.
There is some question as to whether he actually hit the serpent because he throws his hammer at it. But High here says, no, we think it's still alive and is going to come back. The fight is still on at Ragnarok. Important to know with this serpent that it spits poison. Horrifying.
Yeah, it is a venomous, not only massive, but poison. So Thor is impressive, huh?
Oh my gosh, yes.
That's a good lineup of stories right there. Those are some of the big ones. There's only like one or two other major Thor stories, and we'll get to some of them later. But those are some of his more famous ones. We move now into one of the most famous stories of all of Norse myth, and this is where we get into the story of Balder.
Balder is the one who's just perfect. Everybody loves Balder. He's beautiful. He's merciful. He's all the good stuff. And I believe it's Frigg. She makes everyone solemnly promise that Balder should not be harmed by anything. Fire, water, iron, any kind of metal, stone, earth, tree, disease, animals, nothing. Nothing is allowed to hurt Balder.
And everything gladly promises this because, as you said, everything loves Balder. Well, in this world where everything has promised to not hurt him and turn away from him, what are you going to do? You're going to play a game where you start chucking things at Balder.
Yeah, like, see, it works. He's protected.
It's hilarious. All the gods are gathered. Balder's hanging out, and they're shooting arrows at him. They're throwing knives and rocks and swords and sticks and anything they can think of. They think this is hilarious because as it comes up, all these things have promised not to harm him. And so they just divert and fall off him, and nothing harms him, nothing touches him, and they just think this is a great game. Almost everyone thinks this is a great game. Loki steps in again. And again, Loki sometimes is kind of funny and helpful. In this case, though, this is Loki at his darkest. It's not really clear why he does this. I mean, could you discern that? I couldn't.
It says he's capricious, and everybody loves Balder. He's Balder the good. Loki is not good.
No, and he comes up to this gathering, and he comes up to actually Frigg, the one who has gotten all these promises from everything, and he disguises himself. And in the form of an old woman, he says, what's going on here? And she tells him exactly what we just said. And he says, really? Everything promised? And she says, well, almost everything. There's a mistletoe over there that is far too young, so I didn't even bother to ask it, but how can it harm him anyway? And then she goes on. Well, Loki now knows what he needs to know. And so he takes the mistletoe and he fashions it into some form of dart. But he is not the one that throws it at Balder. He goes and finds a character we've met, the blind god Hodir. And I said that was going to be important, that he's blind. And Loki goes up to Hodir and he says, why are you not honoring Balder? Everybody else is honoring him by throwing things at him. Why are you not doing that? Don't you like him? And Hodir says, well, I'm blind. I can't see him to throw anything at him, or I would. I'd give him that honor. And Loki says, no problem. I will guide your hand. And so he has Hodir, the blind god, grab the mistletoe dart. He guides his hand, and he throws it. And it strikes Balder, and Balder is dead.
It's interesting, though, because all the gods, all the Aesir, it says their tongues failed them, and they all are like-minded. They want to wreak vengeance on whoever caused this. But no one could do so. It was a place of such sanctuary. Where were they? Asgard?
In Asgard. And this will come up several times. And this is another example of the complexity of the world and the social interactions, and how if you don't understand that complexity, some of this doesn't make sense. The idea of hospitality was so vitally important in the Scandinavian world that if somebody is within your gates, and this will come up later, you cannot harm them. You cannot kill them. There also are ties of friendship and family that cannot be broken. This shows up in a lot of the sagas and a lot of the other writings. So in this case, and we think this is weird, but they blame Odin. They blame the blind god who was tricked. He was the one that actually threw the dart. And they want to take vengeance on him, but they can't because they have these rules in place, this interconnection. So the only way that they can take vengeance on him is to have another child, a new god is born, that can then take vengeance upon this god, because the way it all plays out, he's not part of those same interactions and connections. And so that's what happens. So Hodir gets killed immediately, right, by this new god that gets born to do it. But Loki isn't off the hook either. And so Loki is also one who gets punished for this action.
As he should. It's really horrible. But Odin actually, it says he takes the death of Balder the hardest because he has knowledge. He has knowledge of what Balder's death will mean to them later on. He has more knowledge than the rest of them do. But I think it's Frigg. She commissioned someone to go fetch Balder from hell.
Hermod. So Hermod is a servant. Now, while this is all happening, the cremation of Balder is also happening. And it's described in incredible terms, right? This great ship, there's all these sacrifices around it. They have to actually summon a frost giant who comes in to push the ship into the ocean because none of the gods can do it or are strong enough. Thor is grabbing his hammer the entire time and really wanting to kill this individual. But again, that's his speed. But while this is happening, Hermod goes down to hell. And basically, the deal that gets struck is hell says, you say that everything loves Balder. Prove it. If everything agrees to weep for Balder, I will release him. I will free him and he will come back to you. And so Frigg goes to town on this. She goes to everything and asks it, weep for Balder, weep for Balder. And everything does. I mean, rocks and stones and trees and people and gods, everything is weeping for the death of this god, except for one. They go to an ogress named Thok. And this is the poem that gets inserted into the work. Thok will weep with dry tears for Baldur's burial. Neither in life nor in death gave he me gladness. Let hell keep what she has. And it says after, it is generally believed that this Thok was Loki, Laufey's son, who has wrought most evil among the Aesas. And so Baldur remains in hell.
Loki put him there and would not allow him to return. He must have really hated that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Loki does get his comeuppance, and so it's said that Loki is eventually captured, and there's this whole story about the way he builds a net and then is caught in a net that the gods make.
Yeah, he turns himself into a salmon, and there's this whole thing with a waterfall and a fire, but he is caught in a net and punished.
Yeah, he is chained to a rock, and above his face a serpent drips poison on him. And so it says that this will be there, this poison will drip onto his face until Ragnarok. But remember, he's married. He's got a wife, and Sigyn, his wife, actually stands by him. And she holds a bowl over his face to catch the venomous drops of the serpent. But sometimes she has to empty the bowl. And when she pulls the bowl away, the serpent venom drops into the face of Loki. And it says this is where earthquakes come from, because that's when he writhes and shakes.
That was new to me. He jerks away so hard the whole earth shakes. That is what you call an earthquake. There he will lie. Loki will lie in bonds until Ragnarok.
Ragnarok.
Next question. What information is there to be given about Ragnarok? I have not heard tell of this before.
Ragnarok is the twilight of the gods, the end of the gods, the final battle of the gods. I should know the answer to this. I don't think Twilight of the Gods is actually an accurate translation. I think that actually comes from a German translation. So when Wagner did his Ring Cycle and he talked about Götterdämmerung, I think that is the Twilight of the Gods. So that's how we interpret it now. But anyway, it's this cataclysmic ending for which Odin has been preparing his entire life. I mean, the whole purpose of what he does with the warriors in battle is to bring heroes to him to fight this battle. But it's a doomed battle that he is going to lose. And knowing that, they still face it. It's a fascinating thing. But there are some warnings about when Ragnarok is going to come. And the big ones are winter.
Yeah, it starts with a mysterious winter, mine calls it Fimbulwinter. And here's where the wolves catch up to the sun and the moon, and they are devoured.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, earlier on in this story where they gamble with the sun and the moon. That was going to be the wages for the builder of the walls, right, of Asgard. Here, the wolves actually catch up. They've been doomed this whole time anyway. But here, the earthquakes and all the bonds break. Fenwolf, who's been bound, he escapes from his fetter. Loki, who's being chained and dripped on by this poison, he's released. There's this huge war between the gods and the anti-gods.
Yeah, and there are very specific combats that are outlined. There's also more going on, these great armies and wars that are happening, but there are specific combats, and the forces of evil really approach, first of all, I love this, I don't love it, but on a ship. The ship called Naglfar. And did you read about this? This ship is made from the untrimmed toenails of dead men.
Gross.
It is gross. But it also says, so trim your toenails to make this ship smaller.
You play a role in this.
You are helping Loki, who helms this ship, by not trimming your toenails. I just think that's hilarious.
I underlined it in my book. Lest anyone die with untrimmed nails.
Yeah, hygiene's important, people. Anyway, in a much more serious note are the combats. And so let's go through kind of some of the biggies in turn. We had mentioned Frey. Frey is unarmed. He has no sword. And it is he who takes on Surt. This is the fire giant of Muspelheim. This is the one who comes and burns everything. Everything is burned down, and Frey falls to Surt because he is unarmed. His decision he made about his wife back then has an impact on this battle at the end of time. Tyr, I think we already mentioned, he goes down to Garm. So they fight, and I think they kill each other.
Don't they all kill each other? I think both sides die in battle.
Pretty much universally, yes. And let's talk about the biggies. So Thor, who could it be but the world serpent? This battle, Thor wins. So this isn't that they kill each other. Thor kills the Midgard serpent. He wins this battle. But in its death, the poison, the venom gets unleashed from this serpent. And it says Thor is only able to take 9 steps before he is overcome by the poison and he falls. Odin. Odin is consumed by the Fenris wolf. All his planning, all his scheming, everything he's tried to do, he cannot escape his doom. He does not kill the wolf kills him. It wins this battle. But now we go back to one of those other weird things we mentioned earlier.
Having a thick shoe.
His son with the thick shoe. And apparently this shoe is made from the strips that are cut off from the shoes of men. So all these leather scraps that get cut off from the toes and heels of shoes that like cobblers do, this is what goes to thicken and build that shoe. So if you want to help, make sure you're cutting off more leather from the front and the back of your shoe. And it says that Vide, his son, steps on the lower jaw of the wolf and then raises the upper jaw up and he splits him in half with the power of this shoe. And so it is the son of Odin, but not Thor, this other son that is able to kill the wolf that has killed his father. But ultimately, everything falls. Everything catches fire and everything is doomed.
Then the king asks, what will happen then after heaven and earth and all the world is burned and all the gods and all mankind are dead? You said previously that everyone shall live in some world or other forever and ever. And there's this renewal. I mean, there's been this buildup, this looking forward towards this end of the gods, this great battle for all these stories from the beginning. And here there's this renewal, living forever and ever in mansions.
And there's some interesting people here because it's interesting who's gone and who's not. So you have the sons of Thor are here with his hammer. They still have his hammer. Thor doesn't come back, but his sons are there. You have the sons of Odin who are there. You have Balder. Balder returns in this regeneration. Why Balder? I don't know. Because again, Odin's not there. Thor's not there. They die indeed and are gone. But you have these others who come back and return. And it's, this really interesting cycle. But,
do you know then when Odin felt the burden of Balder's death because he knew what it meant for the Aesir? Do you know what that means? Because he wasn't at that final battle. Would it have been different? Is that the idea? Odin knew something that if Balder had been there, would have turned out differently for the gods? Maybe,
but I don't know the answer to that. And there is so much mystery around this. There's that question, and then there's another one that will come up over and over. Odin is always getting into riddling contest, and he always cheats to win. So the way he cheats is the question repeatedly that ends the contest is he asks the person he's competing against, what did Odin whisper into Balder's ear on his funeral pyre? And it's never said. No one knows. Only Odin knows. So there's all this mystery around Odin and Balder and his death and Ragnarok that I don't know the answer to, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to. There is one other thing, though, that comes back at the end, besides all these good things we mentioned. Nidhogg. Do you remember? The thing that was nibbling on the bottom of the tree of Yggdrasil? It's there, too. And so it's not like a Christian regeneration of the righteous and all things good. It is some cyclical regeneration where there are good things, but very clearly there are also some evil things there as well. And so we don't know much about this. I don't know much about this. But again, it's fascinating.
And the Justice High, and the third kind of wrap this up with talking to the king, asking questions. And now if you know any more questions to ask further into the future, I do not know where you will find answers. For I have heard no one relate the history of the world any further on in time. And may the knowledge you have gained do you good.
Then Gangler heard a terrible noise on all sides, and when he looked about him, he stood outdoors on a level plain. He saw neither hall nor burg. He went his way and came back to his kingdom, and told the tidings which he had seen and heard. And ever since, those tidings have been handed down from man to man, until Snorri wrote them down. This ends the Fooling of Gylf. What an incredible story. What an incredible collection of knowledge and background. And what a fascinating way of doing it. To lay all this groundwork, inserting enough stories that you're willing to keep reading, and then finally getting into these fascinating stories at the end, until by the time we're done, we have the names of the gods, we have stories of the gods, we have stories of creation, and we have stories of Ragnarok and the regeneration at the end. It really is an incredible collection, but interestingly enough, it's only a part of the Prose Edda, because there are more stories coming up with Bragi's talk. Now, as we said earlier, there's a prologue and an afterword. The afterword to the Fooling of Gylf is very short, and, well, I'll just read it. The Aces now sat down to talk and held their council, remembering all the tales that were told to Gylf. They gave the very same names that had been named before to the men and places that were there. This they did for the reason that, when a long time has elapsed, men should not doubt that those Aces of whom these tales were now told, and those to whom the same names were given, were all identical. There was one who is called Thor, and he is Asa Thor the Old. He is Oku Thor, and to him are ascribed the great deeds done by Hector in Troy. But men think that the Turks have told of Ulysses, and have called him Loki, for the Turks were his greatest enemies. And that ends. Yeah, the prologue and the afterword,
They're confusing because they don't fit with the rest of it.
They really don't, and I don't think they add much, but the part in the middle, boy, that's good.
They are good. And so this is not, we will not go through the whole Younger Edda today. Yes?
Yeah, I think this is going to be our second 2-part episode, but I am really excited to talk about the next one, because in Bragi's talk, this is where Bragi is the poet, and he's trying to explain what things need to be known to understand poetry. And now he just does story after story after story, and they are so fun, and I'm really looking forward to it.
So let's wrap up this first part, the tricking of Gylfi. Is it Gylf or Gylfi?
I have no idea.
Tell me just overall, what do you like about it? Why do they strike you? Because as you said, you're a Christian. These aren't your beliefs. You're not counting on Odin and Thor and anything like that for a faith system. What do you like about them?
I like several things about it. One, I just think the stories are good. There's a lot of them that are just entertaining and funny, and they make me laugh and make me think. I also believe that God has spoken to us, yes, through the Bible, yes, through the life of Christ. I mean, that's his clearest speech. But, I mean, Romans tells us he didn't leave himself without witness to the rest of the world. And so C.S. Lewis talked about the concept of good dreams, these strange stories that permeate all cultures, whether they've heard of Jesus or not, and that speak to something deep and true and profound. And I think there are many echoes of that within these stories. And I think by reading them, we can learn things that are worthy of emulation, but also things that are worthy of rejection. So we can see good and evil. I think there's something noble, but also something very dark about it. And that lends itself to a lot of thought, and I think some improvement if you think through it. The other thing, honestly, is this reminds me about how grateful I am to be a Christian. These would be miserable gods to serve. Even if I like the stories, the humans don't fare well under them. And so there's nothing attractive in terms of the religion to me, but there's a great deal attractive in terms of the mythology and the story.
To me, there's a lot of echoes with the Greek story. So it's funny that they wrap up being saying, "Oh, that's Hector, Thor, and Hector. They're the same. Oh, and Ulysses is in there as well. There we got Loki." But there are echoes between stories. I mean, even between stories from the Bible, you do find echoes, and I don't know. It makes you feel connected, and especially when they talk about the transition of language and cultures over time. I mean, it is a big world, but there's also consistencies across peoples, and everybody has these questions. What was there at the beginning? What's it going to be like at the end? And so I think it's really wonderful to be able to have such a clear idea of what people at a time long ago could have thought.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they built a way of life and thinking around these stories, and they are very retellable. Is that a word? I don't know. I'm going with it. Like even in this, they're told like stories. You could picture, you know, a man or a woman just telling them to their children, telling them to their family, like, oh, you know, don't be like Loki, right?
Yeah, right.
But they'd have examples of those good choices and bad choices, elements we love, elements we don't like, all kinds of things crossing the spectrum of human choices and actions. And I guess in that way, they're fairly timeless. People are still people.
Yeah, I think so.
I enjoyed putting them all together. There's definitely something to it that these stories are still around. And the number of things that include Thor and Loki and Odin, that you've heard these names, even if you haven't read the Edda, they're still out there. So people are still retelling these same stories.
Yes. Well, I think I'll end on this. As a Christian, again, I have no interest in going back to the religion of the Norse, but I do think the stories are worth telling. And on some level, I don't really have a problem that there are some people that are interested in the religion of the Norse. Going back to the great C.S. Lewis quote, which I'm going to paraphrase, pagans, yeah, that's good. Because there's one thing that's been shown through history. A pagan is somebody who is very convertible to Christianity, as we saw in Iceland. And with that, we'll turn the page, and we hope you join us for the next chapter.